To get started, I'm sure we will have a few stragglers, but I think it would be good for us to get started so that we have time at the end for some questions for Erwin and Jeff. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amy Gilman. I'm the Associate Director of the Museum and the Curator of Contemporary Art. And it's been my privilege over the last several years to be involved in the Guest Artist Pavilion Project, the GAPP project here at the museum, which began in about 2006 or 2007, I think, intended to utilize the incredible glass facilities we have here in the building and to, on alternating years, roughly, bring in artists who are very familiar with working in glass, to work in the studio, and on other years bring in contemporary artists who are used to working in other media. And that's the part where I come in. I don't have a lot to do with the artists who are used to working in glass and who come in and we encourage them to experiment in the studio. My role is more to facilitate the experimentation within the medium of glass by artists who are not going to spend the many, many years of needing to get all of the technical know-how in order to understand what it's like to work in glass, and instead to really utilize the incredible staff we have here as a way of providing artists with an opportunity to experiment. And that's really what the goal is. And for tonight, we're going to focus not so much on giving you a lecture by Erwin about his work or about this particular piece, but we're really going to talk about the process that got us to this point. So I'm hoping that everyone has taken a little time to see the piece that is actually right behind us in the courtyard here, and we'll talk about what led to the creation and the installation of this work. And to give you some other context, is that part of the artist residency is actually specifically, and it's actually written in the contract with the artist, is that the intention is not necessarily to produce finished work. This is unusual for artist residencies in that we don't have a requirement that the artist gift to the museum anything that's finished, etc. And that's actually very intentional. It's not that we wouldn't love to have work, certainly would love to have work by Erwin, but instead to actually encourage them to think differently about what it is that they're doing. What did I do? And allow them some space to fail, right? Because when you get to a certain point in a career, it gets harder to fail. It gets harder to take a risk and do something if you're used to working in a certain way. And I'll show you slides of two previous GAPP residents and tell you a little bit about what they did while they were here. But before I do, I want to introduce the two people I have up here on our panel today. Jeff Mack, who is the manager of the Glass Studio, very familiar to many of you, and he led a team of people, and we'll mention some specific individuals in a little bit, who work with each of the artists on realizing their vision. Right? So part of it is understanding what is technically possible, part of it is understanding what is physically possible in the time that we have allotted, and part of it is really exposing artists to the possibilities in the glass world. And of course, almost pretty much needs no introduction here. On the far left is Erwin Redl, the GAPP artist for this year. And I just want to say that Erwin and I have been speaking about doing a project for the museum together for many years, long before this came about. We've talked in a number of different circumstances. He's been kind enough to open his studio to many people, including the ambassadors from the museum and the Apollo Society. And he creates installations that are largely light and sound-based that are installed all over the world. And it is a real privilege to have someone of that caliber living in Bowling Green and employing people in our local economy and making this his home base. And of course, I think it behooves us as the museum here to recognize that talent in our region and to really find the right thing to do. And when we got to this moment where we were talking about doing a project here, it was very clear that the right thing to do would be to have Erwin respond to the incredible architecture within this building. So I'm going to click on the next slide, and what you're going to see here is a time-lapse video of the installation. And we're continuing to take time-lapse photography of the installation, and we'll do so until it comes down. So you'll be able to eventually have a video where you see this in all weather.
Thanks to Tim Motz for setting that up too.
Yay, Tim's here in the back.
So can I comment that today we actually had a harvest moon? And a harvest moon means that we have 12 hours of moonlight followed by 12 hours of sunlight.
Ah.
So what a day to choose.
So we'll see what
the this installation.
Yes. Oh, how perfect, isn't it?
Perfect. We have.
We planned it like that, absolutely.
How do you do it?
Right. So actually, one of the things I actually love about the time-lapse video is that it gives us this incredible sense of movement, right? Which, of course, experiencing the piece in the museum is dramatically different. You have this incredible sense of stillness. Although you really do, when you look at it, and I hope everybody has been watching it, is that it will move. And it can move fairly dramatically together. And with the gusts of wind, the small sort of changes in the weather, etc. And there you see Erwin there. And you see in the back that it's not fully complete yet. That's actually part of the process that you're seeing back there. So before I start to drill some questions into our duo here, I just want to mention a couple of artists that have come before. The first contemporary artist that we had working in the GAPP program was in 2008, and Redl Bailey, who's an Atlanta-based artist, came here. And as you can see, very different kinds of work. Right? He's a very different kind of artist. He's mostly a painter, and he was very fascinated by the idea of lanterns. And in fact, they did all of these experiments, blowing large glass bubbles, casting lanterns, doing all of these different things that have gone on to affect the kinds of materials that he includes in his larger installations. And then probably the one that would be the more familiar to you is Beverly Fishman from 2011 with her Glass Pills installation, which was just in the, was installed in the cavities here. And that, I will say, was probably the one point where we really knew that this was a great idea, which was to bring in contemporary artists and expose them to this material. Because Beverly has gone on to continue to work in glass. And this was not just a one-off for her. This has actually become a major body of work for her, something that she didn't do before she came to the studio. And that's the kind of impact we want to have on artists. And then we had the opportunity very briefly to work with Esther, who was working on a larger installation that happened at the Wilsonian in Miami, in which the studio staff facilitated the making of glass tools for her, which were included in this large installation, which is now traveling around the world. And here we have Erwin. Erwin huddled over his cart here, and this brings us to the reason why we're really here tonight. So, Erwin, I thought maybe we could start with you and talk a little bit about the process that you took to think about what could be possible with this residency.
Yes. There were many options, obviously, because from my other work, the light installation work, I'm keenly interested in architecture. Number one, because of my personal background, but also because just of the scale that I'm working on very often. And this building is, like one of the most amazing museum buildings in the world, I have to say, and was the first building by Sana, who's now like through the roof famous all over the world. And the idea to do something in this building as a light artist, where there's no shelter from light, or from natural light, is obviously a challenge, but then also to work with a medium that I'm not familiar with. But then I thought about what are the similarities between what I do and what glass does. I mean, both are ephemeral media, because light is, you can't grasp it, it's just light waves. And then glass is also ephemeral because by nature clear glass is invisible, but it has gravitas. So it has something, this ambivalent creature, it's there, but it's not there. It's invisible, but it's visible by its presence as a volume. And so I definitely welcome the challenge to come up with something that is out of my comfort zone. And I think that was the idea of residencies, for people who don't work with this medium, to just go over the deep end or get thrown over the cliff, and then come up with an idea that is doable, and with the help of people who actually know what they're doing, because I didn't know what I'm doing.
So that actually leads me to, Jeff, maybe you could talk about, and maybe you could introduce the staff of people who are actually here tonight who worked on this a little bit, or a lot.
Yeah, some of the people who helped out are here. Brian Strankar's in the back there. Austin Littenberg, key player. Sten Newber is here. So those are the people who are present. Steve Cothern also helped, and he just left to go home. But everybody pitched in a little bit and helped out with the project, and had ideas. Also, we had help from Tom Burke back there in the white shirt. He's from the maintenance department outside of the glass department. And also the art handlers helped with the installation for a day.
You can just imagine that this is actually a really complicated installation for something that looks so elegant and simple when it's done. Jeff, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you did when you first introducing Erwin to glass in general. What was, like, how did, bringing him in, what did you do?
We gave him some books.
Very experiential.
We showed him around the collection a bit. We showed him around the studio. We showed him sort of doodads that are around the studio, projects that we're working on.
Is that an official term?
Yeah, doodads, yeah. Or friggers, like little bits of glass around that demonstrate the various techniques for like volume, shape, texture, all these different things that you can achieve and how you achieve them. Erwin just seemed to sort of absorb some of that. I think he went home with the books, and yeah, he still has the books. We got to remember that. But a lot of what we did was a sort of like a correspondence thing. He would come here, get some information, he would go away, and then come back with some ideas that we would start to discuss. He would come and make some drawings for ideas, and we'd talk about the viability, but he obviously, he immediately sort of understood what he could and wanted to do with the material. He had some very definite ideas.
So there were a couple of ideas that he had proposed. So this is not the only idea that came out of Erwin's head. Erwin, do you want to talk about a couple of slides?
Basically, before that you saw me like leaning over some architectural drawings, so I spent a lot of time in the building just taking measurements and then just soaking in the building by osmosis. The more time you spend in the building, the more you become one with that space. And then I came up with 3 proposals, and one uses quote-unquote my traditional media, which is light, and me and my studio, we came up with this, we call it LFM, it's like everything has to be in a 3-letter acronym. It's light frame module. And you see those little modules here in my studio in the loading dock, and it's about 10 by 10 inches. It's acrylic with little dimples, or 64 dimples drilled into acrylic, and then side lit with LEDs. So all the colors are created by LEDs that are embedded in that frame. I don't want to go into like details, but it's like one little Lego block that we developed in my studio, and I use this Lego block for several installations. And one of the options that I presented to the museum was titled Viewing, where we used the big, or the courtyard 1, in the cavity around the courtyard, place, I think there were like 80 or so of those panels, or 40 pairs, because you can see through that panel and then create complementary colors when you look through 2 of them. And it would be like a viewing station for the people in that courtyard, especially if there's a wine tasting on Friday or people go out, and it would just more or less be a window that you look into and see your environment in a completely different way. Number one, the outside environment, but also the inside environment and the collection itself. And then here, also picking up on something that I did before for a very large installation in Los Angeles. It's just glass cubes, and they're about like, it's called 4 by 4 inches, or 4 by 4 by 4 inches because it's cube. And then on the bottom, there's an array of 24 LEDs, high brightness LEDs that just light up that cube, so it becomes this glowing sugar cube or so on the bottom. And I just wanted to make this very quiet sanctuary in the back where the Tiffany windows are. It's like the most furthest away space from the entrance, and make it kind of almost like a meditation piece there. Suspended from the ceiling. I like suspension lately because it's kind of interacting with this movement in space. So those were like the 3 proposals. One was the viewing, the cubes, and then floating. And first it was just called floating. The in silence came later. This piece came more or less out of a failure, which is always very
But we like failures.
Yeah,
Failure is
because
good.
initially I presented as a 3rd piece, a piece using flat glass, like 4 by 4 inches, like industrial flat glass, suspended from the ceiling in a way, like a scattered way, in a grid system. But then you have like exploded cubes, more or less, like where you have like just one side of a cube, or 2 sides, or 3 sides, or 4 sides, and so you have this kind of random assembly of just plates that in our imagination form cubes, but by only seeing 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 parts of that cube. It goes back to Toledo, who did similar things like in the 60s. And we did a test hanging out there. Sorry, there's some feedback. We did a test hanging out there in this little courtyard, just hanging those plates and exposing it to the elements. Mm-hmm. And of course they were swaying like crazy. So they were hitting each other, and it was just...
That's problematic in a $32 million building.
Yeah, well, they weren't hitting the glass,
They were like
sails.
but they were hitting each other, which is little sails, exactly. And so I said, well, it's nice, I still want to pursue that piece, but as an indoor piece, and I'm working in my studio to set it up as an indoor piece. But the next step was just thinking, well, I like the idea that I interact with the outdoors, but I have to interact in a way that it doesn't destroy my piece. So it was just, well, what's the least, or the most aerodynamic shape, which is a sphere. So it was like, how can I just translate the idea to something that is actually something to be realized? And then I said, okay, a sphere, we hung up some spheres in my studio, and then there was the idea, of course, hollow would be nice, and then I think then we started blowing, I didn't blow myself, the royal we started blowing spheres, and Brian with a beard, and so we did solid spheres, we did hollow spheres, and then we hung them outside. It was completely correct. Yes, it swayed, but not as much as the glass plates, obviously. So it was already like very close to where I wanted to be. But then suddenly, I don't know how it came into my little head, but it was like, why don't I fill those spheres with liquid? And because I saw them in the rain, and then he said, okay, I put a liquid in there that acts like a level. And it's kind of a reflection with what's happening on a macrocosm, on a big scale, with the 381 spheres, I think it is. Also happens on a microscopic scale, or not microscopic, but on a small scale within each single element. So it's kind of this, two universes with spheres kind of interlocking in scale and idea. And
so I just want to stop you for 1 second because I want to talk a little bit about the process at this point, the actual studio process. So we've now gotten to this point where there's been all of this experimentation, right? And now we're starting to try some things, and now it's the responsibility of the studio to actually sort of realize making 381 and probably, 450 or so?
It was more than that, yeah.
About
Keep going.
Yeah.
800?
initially it was just 400.
Because now it's also like, it's getting them very consistent, right? Because if they're inconsistent, you will notice it in this work.
Yeah.
They have to be very consistent. So can you talk a little bit about the process?
Well, first of all, thanks Brian for making these and then making them again.
Sure.
Oh, right. You'll hear about you'll hear about the massive failure in a minute.
So we made a couple prototypes for Erwin. He liked the sphere and did some stuff with the sphere. So he came up with a dimension for his module. Essentially, it's this sphere, and then he's going to fill it with liquid, and there's certain parameters about the opening and the diameter. Actually it's a very simple piece to make. So it went pretty quickly. It probably took a week to make them all. And then we had a little bit of a disaster.
Okay, so let's talk about the disaster. Because I love talking about failure, because we are at this museum, right? And by the time it goes up on our walls, you don't see all of that, right? We don't let you know about the things that didn't work, right? So let's talk about, Erwin, maybe you could talk a little bit about the armature as to how they're hung first.
No, I mean, what also has to be mentioned, there was a certain time pressure, because the time we were running out of time, because the idea was that we finished the residency in June, and then I had to travel for months in mid-July, so the idea was let's just get it, we have to get it done now. And so we rushed, which is never good. But, talking about the armature, so I had to come up with an idea how to suspend this installation. And I've done a lot of this kind of engineering before, so we used materials from my studio, like metal channels, and they were all screwed together and bolted together, and we weight them down.
They're all on the roof, by the way, on the ground.
You have to be careful, because you cannot break the water seal on the roof, and you have to make sure that there's no sag in the cables, and so come up with a suspension system with springs and turnbuckles. So there's a whole little hidden mechanical infrastructure that nobody's supposed to see it, but it's always there, like in any building. It's like all like any building.
And actually, when the light hits it a little bit like this, it actually is quite beautiful in its own way, and pretty unintentional. But that's one of the things it does. It becomes these little stalactites coming down. Yeah.
And it all worked out quite well for a day.
For a day. Yes, this is the roof.
So we came up with this kind of very efficient rigging systems where everything was strung up on tubes first, and then we lowered the tubes, and it was all kind of quite elegant, and there was a whole group of people.
It was also really hot.
Yeah, there was a bit of
How hot? This was the period where we had the 2 weeks of really, really intensely hot weather. Right, and that's not exactly an unexposed courtyard, right?
So because you get the reflections of the sun in the glass plus the sun itself. So it's you get a double whammy.
So they started hanging, oh, I don't know what happened, oh, that is the end. Where are the ones?
No.
No, that was the end of it.
We have disaster pictures?
We did have disaster pictures, I don't know what happened to those.
Maybe just skip that one for a second, or go past it a little bit.
No, that's the end, Jeff.
Really?
Okay, let's talk about the disaster. Okay, so they install them. They install almost all of them.
We were like almost 2/3 done or so.
2/3 the way done.
And there was a big gathering, like a staff gathering here, and then everybody was slapping shoulders. And
Oh, it's fantastic! Isn't this great?
And I was just going. This was Friday afternoon.
This is Friday afternoon. Isn't this terrific?
And Monday morning, I get the call.
What's the call?
The call is that all of the metal loops that were put into the spheres are corroding.
Over the weekend.
Over the weekend, yeah, they rusted, and actually they were like growing hairs on the inside.
Pretty much. Oh, yeah, here we go. Now you can really see the disaster.
So they started looking really scrappy, and it's possibly because of the reaction. Maybe Erwin
Well,
describe it a little
because
better.
we tested everything, but we just didn't test the final assembly because we had to figure out how to make it not evaporate, obviously, the liquid in there, make sure nothing grows into that liquid. So we used vinegar and used the red food.
hydrochloric acid.
Yeah, used a little red food dye just to color it red. And then in order to suspend it, we inserted those little bendy metal wire that you use to suspend Christmas ornaments, and then sealed it with silicone. The issue was that...
This sounds very logical.
Yeah.
Like, oh, what could go wrong with that?
But then the wire started corroding because there was extremely aggressive vinegar. It was just a couple of percentage point acidic. Just started.
It ate the metal.
But there was also an electrochemical reaction because there's a different potential outside the sphere and inside the sphere created by the liquid. So it's like this old potato experiment. So we made a battery basically.
A little battery.
A very low voltage battery which accelerated the corrosion process. They were like growing like hairs, looked like a spider.
Yeah, you can actually see it. You can come up here and take a look at them. Was sort of amazing. Jeff called on Monday morning to, well, I'm sure a number of people.
Yeah. So for a little while there
The
were.
Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah, and we thought it was funny because Erwin's was really trying to make a piece that was not electrified, and he still ended up making a piece that had, electrical potential. So, but yeah, we had to dismantle the piece, and
All of them.
yeah, and so some people got to see for a period of time there were nuts and bolts hanging there instead of the spheres. So that was a little mini installation.
In this one image where I'm standing, and you see those little flags in the back. Those are just cable ties that hold up nuts and bolts, just to weigh them down to them, because those are like, I think those are fresh spheres.
All the way
Where I'm
down.
standing, but in the back, this we didn't. This was just at the end, but last day. We installed the final.
So the other thing I'll mention is that when you start to realize that you're having this kind of problem and you have red food dye in this building, we don't usually have like red wine in this building, right? So we're having 380 spheres full of red dye suspended in the courtyard. You have to make sure that conservation and the facilities group signs off on all of those materials, right? So there was this moment where, Jeff calls in this total panic. He's like, I don't know what to do about this. What's going to happen? Can we even finish it?
Yeah, and also I didn't make sure to check those things. Can we use these materials with Suzanne Hargrove and Paul Bernard? So we had some discussions about how we were going to move forward with it and whether or not it could happen. Because if say there's the conservation lab is also right below this piece. So if there was a windstorm and like 15 of them broke and it was oozing red dye vinegar on, you know, an antique piece of glass that's being restored. That could be a
That'll
problem.
come out of your
too.
paycheck.
Right. So yeah, so we had some discussions about how to move forward with it, and we had to do some testing. That you know, this goes beyond what I ever imagined. Like you had to do, but when you think about the liability here and the collection and the building itself is a work of art, so you have to be mindful of that. And Erwin is working within this structure, so you know, we did testing. We froze the modules, the spheres, at like 31 below zero for a day.
After this disaster, we basically started from the
We
scratch.
tested all
We
of
tested
them.
everything.
We had to come up with a new sealing mechanism.
How did you do that? Suzanne actually has a deep freeze. I'm serious. This is part of the like behind the scenes you like never hear about. Is if you want to make sure that something doesn't have bugs, or you want to make sure you're testing something because it's going to be outside. Suzanne has a deep freezer that she can put it in. It also helps deal with smells, by the way. That wasn't an issue here, but so froze them. What else did she do? Oh, she tested weight.
We put more weight on them,
Yeah.
so there's a safety factor of 8 basically in there, like weight-wise.
And then the next day we put them in an oven and cooked them
Yeah,
for 24 hours at like 250 degrees. So we gave it the new module, the new design, you know, had a stainless
Stronger,
steel.
faster, better.
It's basically
It's a little different.
The steel, the little stainless steel rings. Number one is stainless steel, marine grade stainless steel, and it never comes in contact with the air in the vinegar compartment. So it's just sealed into the silicone itself, but never goes down through the opening, and it's holding up.
But this is actually one of the beautiful things, right? So we had this huge, gigantic failure, but we learned an enormous amount. But it's also about how can we, you have something like that, and the question is not, you know, do you just pack it all in? Like, oh, well, that was a failure. Like, I'm sorry, Erwin, that was it. You had it up for a weekend. Is the how can we do this so that we can realize the vision that he has created here? Because that was something that we all knew was going to be really remarkable. And I still think, I mean, I would love still to do some of the other proposals that involve the actual light, because this building, of course, would be really quite remarkable with that. But from the purpose of the actual program, which is to engage artists in ways that they have not been used to working, is that this actually pushed Erwin differently. And that's, as a curator, that is really interesting to me. And so Erwin sort of, at the resolution, when we finally got it to the point where it was all done, sort of, does it actually work the way that you'd intended it to?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's little things that I would maybe do slightly differently. But we also had to change something on the roof because actually the suspension mechanism moved a little bit. So we had to tie it back to a lot different structure of the building. But we also overcame that. No problem.
So will you work in glass again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I raise a glass every day. No, just kidding. But no, I mean I definitely will. Jeff and I, we already like fabricating other parts for different things.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still working. We're going to do the cubes one as an extension.
Oh,
of this.
great.
So we've already made the cubes, and he's going to do something with them.
So that's one of the other things to know, that when we do these experiments, like we don't retain them here at the museum. When there's experiments to be done, like with all the Radcliffe stuff, like all of that actually went to Radcliffe if you wanted it, right? Was that the experiments can go to Erwin's studio and he can use them the way that he chooses. They can become inspirations for other work, etc. And I think that that's also an important part of this process here, is that. So maybe we should answer some questions. Yes.
Is it a permanent exhibit?
Is it permanent? It is not permanent. However, actually right now the goal is for us to have it up for a whole year. That will in part depend on how it actually holds up. under real weather conditions. I mean, it's actually held up incredibly well so far. It has been up since July now. So, but we are continuing to take the time lapse. So, we would hope is that, like, let's just say in July of next year, that when it comes down, that we'll have an entire year's worth of the time lapse, and maybe we'll reappear in another way, or maybe we'll talk to Erwin about doing something different. But it's partly for us a way of activating the spaces in the building that we hadn't been activating with art before. Part of that is when you finish the building in 2006, and it's very precious. You know, it's sort of like, I mean, it's a little bit like your new car, right? You really just like you don't want anybody to eat in it, you don't want anybody to do anything in it. And then the longer you have it, the more it actually becomes very familiar, and now you want to play in it a little bit more. So we're installing pieces in the cavities, which we had not done earlier. And this is the first time we're having an artist actually respond to the architecture of the building, but I do not think it will be the last.
I just want to thank everybody who worked on this project. Yes.
We will go with the
Questions, yes.
All right, I have three things. First of all, it's fantastic to see time-based glasswork in the Glass Pavilion. Yay. Second of all, did you take photographs of what you had to do to the roof in order to make this happen? Because the thing about this building, I don't know if people know, but there's like Lex Luthor's cave below this floor that makes the minimalism of this building possible. And I'm wondering whether you had a Lex Luthor's cave, you know, of wires and stuff up on the roof. Lex Luthor he's the enemy of Superman. And he lives in this cave on the ground with all these weird things. You know, Superman's all order and victory, and Lex Luthor is all mess and chaos. And thirdly, so that's the question is, you know, the roof. And then the third thing is, okay, so these vials are filled with this red liquid that looks like blood, which creates all this problem with all of this vinegar and electricity. Why didn't you just use some solid cast red marbles?
I wanted to have that. I mean, it was obviously a devil's advocate question.
There's something organic.
No, I wanted to have that live thing happening, almost like a chemistry experiment. And I mean, I didn't see the problem as dramatic as Amy relived it for us. But
Well, it's very important to convey it in a dramatic way.
It was dramatic, but I didn't see a big problem, like a little. I mean, this is like a shot of vinegar. I mean, it's not killing anybody, and it would never seep through the lab downstairs. There's just no way.
These were just a scenario.
This was a
possible scenario.
Worst case scenario. That's what the conservators get paid to do.
But there was just this one problem: how can you seal it? And so we sealed it with different materials and with stainless, and so.
What do we anticipate with the freeze and thaw of our winters here?
Well, it shouldn't freeze. We tested in the freezer with vinegar. Vinegar just has a much lower freezing temperature, and I don't think anything should happen. You might have little icicles on at one point, which would look great.
They would look beautiful,
The only issue I could see is if the snow fills up the courtyard, and then it would just sit there, and when it freezes, because the snow surface freezes, and the freezing or the thawing part would drag it down and probably snap the cable. That would be my only, kind of.
And that will totally depend. I mean, I think we're going to have to watch it. I think that, we do get leaves in this courtyard in the fall, and cleaning that out. It's, you can actually walk around it. It actually isn't quite as close to the edges as it sort of appears, I think. But and Mary, you had a question.
Oh, well, I was just thinking, the red liquid. I mean, you don't think that as it moves that you can actually discern the liquid moving, but it's the idea that you could. So like if jets went over or something, you could, see it shake a little bit,
I think it's more in
that's cool.
our head than in reality, which
Yeah, it's more
where everything is
head, but
happening
it's
anyway.
that way, I think. And then the other thing is, so will you go out there with snow shovels and someone has to go in between everything if the snow gets too big?
We'll see. I'll do it.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll take that as a count, yeah.
How did you arrive at the height of the plane that these create?
I don't know. A lot of things is like, I was relate anything to something like a bike.
What is the height?
I think it's like 12 or 13 inches at this point. For me, something like something that you could just crawl underneath. You know, the way it's like, oh, just here, something that relates to your body. And I want to just go back to Katharina's question about the armature on the roof. Yes, there are a lot of cables. I took some pictures, but it's just unistrut channels with turnbuckles and springs, and they are all now tied back to gutters because the tension was a little bit too high. We weighed it down, but didn't weigh it down too much, and we propped it up against the rim, and it just wasn't enough. So we tied it back to the gutters with steel cables, and now it's pretty interesting.
And you can't drill into the roof, so right. So it has to.
It's like a piano frame up there almost with strings, and they had to adjust the tension, and he and Austin did that. It was like tuning to get everything leveled out, which is really interesting when you know that Erwin was trained as a musician.
That's where the in silence part came to it, because I thought it's like a big instrument that we're tuning, but it doesn't really sound. It resonates in our little brain.
Can you photograph it? Because that's an
Oh yeah.
You have, okay.
Okay. Here we go.
I just had a couple of comments. The one was that the aesthetic really moves me because, first of all, there's like this really hardcore geometry to this, in terms of the sphere and in terms of the grid. But then, there's this kind of metaphysical quality because it reacts to the slightest current of air in nature. So there's this really amazing tie between almost mathematics, science, physics, and nature, which occurs right here. Like it's this incredible dichotomy to me because it is like very fluid. And I was watching it one day and watching kind of how just the slightest wave motion would be really apparent to you. How the little balls would kind of move to the right side and then in the center stay still. Stay just totally stationary and then shift to the other side. So I think aesthetically it's this really beautiful kind of marriage between nature and this kind of mathematical hardcore kind of thing that occurs in, I don't know, like the golden truck, the golden, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we can really, interpret into it. I just deliver like a tool, and then everybody does something with that.
It's cool because that's what you do. You kind of lay the groundwork for people to kind of introduce. But it still has those, still has that kind of deeper meaning. Yeah. And the other thing is that, nowadays, artists aren't working alone. Or the conception of the work is the most important in the work. And people are really being collaborative, which is an awesome thing. Making use of each person's talent to create a vision.
Or I think actually over here and then back here. Go ahead.
I was wondering, did you write the label that's on the wall about this work?
I think partially, it's kind of collaborative text.
Yeah. I think the one on the left, I think that was the one that you looked at and adjusted.
Because that's pretty philosophical and metaphysical.
I have no idea what
it didn't make sense to me, so I was wondering if you could elaborate on it.
What did I write?
You have to go read it. Something about society and individual, and I just saw balls.
No, I mean, I have to say, I think I also mentioned it like on Wednesday, so that I'm not interested in a single object. Objects kind of bore me. I hate to say that they're just for me not very interesting. I'm interested in how objects relate to each other, or what's happening between the objects, or what's happening in space without objects. And that's why I create basically just little sensors, that sense space, or sense structure in space, or insert a structure in space and see what happens. So it's like more an alchemistic process than like make a massive sculpture. I mean, I admire a lot of sculptors, and it's just not what I do. And then it's just different. It's a completely different. It's a pure installation approach, not a sculpture approach to form. And like James Turrell said, he's plumbing space. I can always just quote him because that's the best quote.
And space.
Plumbing.
Plumbing space.
He's a plumber.
He's a plumber. That's very pragmatic. Yeah.
No, you had a
Well, I want to know, given the distance between the bulbs on the one hand and the wires going up, how did you get in there without disturbing the karma of the piece?
Oh, you
I don't use that term, but no.
You don't, actually.
It's Photoshop.
No. Well, just you have to keep your weight, like.
You don't do it without disturbing them. They do get disturbed.
Yeah, but it is 2 feet, so you can sneak in there.
You can't sneak in.
Yes. I mean, you disturb them, and if there's something to repair or take a leaf out, you can definitely go in there. But you have to be careful. I mean, when we installed, we had those big sombreros because the sun was just,
There's great pictures of that.
We had to take them off to go in there because the sombreros were bigger than we were. That's why.
I have another question. I
Yes.
just realized there's another meaning to this piece, okay? Because I can't get away from this thing of blood, I bet you if there's 13 inches, you measure them, I bet you if you lay below the line of these balls, it would be just the height, of a human body with enough air above it. I think you need some photographs when you're lying down.
No, I want to put my camera just underneath with a fisheye lens and just, that's part of a 1-week documentation
We
process.
should all go right underneath you.
Erwin said his first preference on liquid would have been blood.
Yeah, exactly.
That freezes.
We were all right up there.
So I just want to say that this is the second time we've used this particular format for discussing the work. And so what I hope is that you all will give us feedback about this because we want to experiment with different ways of interacting with the artists that we're working with, of different ways of giving you all information about what we're doing and also exposing you to things that you can't learn on the label or just in a regular lecture format. So I hope that you do give us feedback about that. And thank you both for coming, and really especially, I must say, thank you to Erwin for creating something that has helped even those of us who are highly familiar with this building discover something about it anew again, and really see a part of the building that many people just walk by. So, and thank you all for coming tonight.